Welcome to Brain Debate. We are delighted to have Oliver Traldi rejoin us on the show, and we're going to be talking about political beliefs. Oliver has just published a wonderful book on the topic. Would you like to start with a thought experiment?
So, to begin the book, I imagine two friends who are playing a kind of game of words. Uh, they're running through a field filled with hills, and they each pick a hill and try to convince the other one to come up to their hill. And once one of them has been sufficiently persuasive, they run off to another pair of hills and do it again. So in this introduction, I imagine that as they're playing this game, they're suddenly surrounded by a group of many more people. Maybe hundreds of people on each hill, and they can't hear each other. They can't hear the attempts at persuasion. They can't hear the reasons that are given. And instead, to try to get the other side to their hill, they have to figure out some other way. They have to play a tug of war, or have to try to, maybe cut the hill down or something like that. So there's a question of what these friends should do, whether they should keep trying to get the other one onto their side, or whether they should just quit entirely, whether the game is no longer any fun. So I sort of came up with this thought experiment, this sort of imaginary exercise. In one sense, thinking about what our arguments become when other people are involved, when we're members of groups rather than just individuals, and also thinking about the nature of politics, and is there something distinctive about political arguments, political disputes, and political beliefs. And so, yeah, I don't know what you guys think of it. What comes out of it for you?
So in today's world, we've become highly polarized. So the left and the right have such strong positions that it seems very tough to switch from one to the other. I like the idea that you can't even hear the arguments of the other in your thought experiment. That sounds quite accurate. So do you think that hill switching does happen in today's world? It seems like it probably happens a lot less often than it used to.
Yeah, so I definitely think it does happen. One debate that I looked at in writing this book was a somewhat older, not old, 2010s debate in political psychology about whether and under what conditions people change their mind, and in particular whether in cases there was a sort of backfire effect. I forget the term for it, but when you show people evidence that goes against their views, whether they actually believe them more strongly. So some people thought that there was this like strongly irrational thing people did where counter evidence convinced them of the views that it was evidence against. So I definitely think that those things happen sometimes. But on the other hand, political debate does consist, like other debate, often in giving reasons of kinds for our views, right? People will argue for gun control by saying, it's dangerous, people get hurt, people die in accidental gun deaths and things like that. Those seem like reasons to have gun control. And people argue against it by saying, we won't be able to resist a tyrannical government, and we have the right to self-defense and things like that. And those seem like reasons in some sense, or at least attempted reasons against gun control, right? So there's a sense in which, at least at some level, in political debates, we're offering reasons and responding to reasons. I think the thing that starts to worry people is the sometimes seemingly ad hoc or opportunistic nature of the reasons given. So sometimes you offer one reason, it turns out not to be good enough, and you go searching for another, right? That's when you can tell that you're reasoning in a motivated way, right? Because instead of being convinced that you might be wrong, you remain just as convinced that you were right, even though the reasons you thought you had turn out not to be good enough reasons. So yeah, I think that we're certainly worse at reasoning about politics than some other things, but not inescapably so. So yeah, I take a middle ground on a lot of the questions I consider in the book. Sadly, I'm not an extremist about these things. So I think, yeah, we make a lot of mistakes in politics, but also There's also a lot of people out there who are trying to figure out the truth about politics and are trying to be thoughtful about it.
So do you think that there's two kinds of reasoning that could go on, where privately people might engage in an actual exercise of reasons and come to a view through deliberation, but because there are social costs in expressing that view publicly, they don't publicly reason, and so they engage in other kinds of methods of persuasion. So they use power to coerce people into adopting their position. They shame others, or they just sort of look left and right and say, well, what's everyone else doing? I guess I should go along with that. Even if they privately believe that the idea is a bad idea, that these other coercive forces play a role in determining this. An example that was put to me recently was a prominent South African politician who's taken a very vocally anti-Israel stance in South Africa. And someone went up to him and said, but you're a very religious Christian who's been to Israel on many occasions. Did you change your mind? And he said, of course I didn't change my mind. He says, I'm very pro-Israel. He says, I just can't say that out loud. So you've got other coercive factors that play a role in what people are willing to say and how they reason. And then you can have a sense in which if people are publicly reasoning in a way that is artificial, dishonest, it can shape people's private intuitions as well, because they might believe the stuff that's being said.
Yeah, I think that certainly happens. And on the other hand, the reverse happens sometimes too, where if you see somebody intelligent publicly reasoning in a sort of manifestly shoddy way, it might occur to you to say the opposite. It might occur to you to say, well, this person can't actually believe this. This can't actually be their sincere reasoning, right? There's an old Freddie DeBoer article that, the more and more I engage in public writing and have private conversations coming out of it, the more I agree with it. It's called, well, I forget the actual, it's called, there's always the back channel or something like that. The term back channel is used in the title. And one thing that I've found constantly, the more people I come into contact with through my public writing, is I get a lot of messages from people you might not expect who say, I disagree with you about some things, I agree with you about others, but let me tell you, there's this one issue, and it's not always the same issue. There's this one issue where I'm just completely against the consensus in my field or the consensus in my social group, and I just can't say anything, because then I would lose and have to switch to a different life, or then maybe I would end up on the side of people who I actually disagree with about almost everything else, which is also an interesting idea. The idea that one has to, if one disagrees with one side about one thing, then one has to find a way to agree with the other side about everything. That one can't just be sort of like in the ether floating, with a variety of positions. So yeah, I think that's definitely true, that there's this public and private reasoning. And like you said, I think it's, an intelligent person might say, I've privately reasoned, in this elaborate way to get to this conclusion, but, that's not rhetorically effective, right? The best rhetoric will not involve using the complicated empirical information or the complicated ethical deductions or something like that led me to come to my view. So I'm gonna say something sort of, a little simplified in public. Maybe use some more inflammatory language or something like that, in order to try to convince people. And that certainly happens too. And that's part of, I'm not a practitioner of politics. I'm sort of an avoider of politics when I can be. And so that's something that doesn't make it into the book too much. But I think one thing, there's this tradition of philosophers writing letters to princes and things like that, here's how to govern, and stuff like that. And I do think the study of political beliefs could influence that sort of letter, where you say, that sort of philosophy where you say, well, given what we know about political epistemology, political psychology, the way people reason about politics, here's how you should govern in terms of people's beliefs.
I have a feeling that this distinction between the private public reasoning, when it comes to political beliefs and political views, might be even more insidious than that. It could be that we have yet another distinction, which is that inside our own heads, we listen to politicians talk and we just think, oh, that's a slimy guy. There's a lot about what he's saying. A, I don't understand. B, that just isn't clear to me. C, that I just can't get fully on board with. But I've got to take a position, and I'm either for him or against him. So I guess I'll be for him. And there's even this sort of bad faith that we have with ourselves about getting on board with political views. Ideologies are always extremely simplified. And I think when you drill down to what's actually being said, there's very little that's being said that's true, ever. So, I think people know that. They know that deep down, but they have to fool themselves into thinking that they have a coherent stance, that they belong to a group that believes X. And so there's sort of this ladder of delusion that happens. So there's self-delusion, and then there's delusion of others. So we delude ourselves, and then we lie to others about what we believe as well. It just seems like political belief is lies all the way up and all the way down.
Yeah, I definitely think that there must be some self-delusion in politics. I mean, one thing you see with political beliefs is that people's political opinions can change very quickly with less of a record of the change than sort of the effusiveness of their expressions at various times might suggest, right? This happens with the sorts of things that I think of as moral fashions, and also happens with more morally serious topics as well. One thing I used to talk about a lot in 2016 when Trump was running for office, I had a lot of friends who were really worried about gay marriage for some reason in the United States, who thought that somehow Trump was going to roll back gay marriage, which I think turned out to be something that certainly personally was not something that concerned him at all, as I understand it. But one thing that somewhat mystified me was that he was running against Hillary Clinton, and during the presidency of Barack Obama, and they had both run in 2008, also opposing gay marriage, right? All of the entire gay marriage revolution in the United States had happened in that 8-year time span. And it struck me that there are probably many American voters who can't remember 8 years in the past, including many of my highly educated, very intelligent friends. And I don't know if that's limited to politics. That could be a more general thing about memory. Maybe I'm stuck in the past in some sense, in my life, or in my psychology. But I do think that there are certainly self delusions about memory in that way. One other thing that I think happens, there's a contrast we might make between reasons and explanations, right? But although they sort of in some ways psychologically feel the same, because there's a sense in which a reason does explain why something is true. So, if something happened, say you observed it, right? You observed an apple falling from a tree, and you said, well, there must be some explanation. And you try out one explanation, and it turns out it can't be right. Well, then you look for more explanations because you know that the apple fell from the tree. So you're just looking for more hypotheses for why this happened. And it seems to me that sometimes in our political reasoning, we do this as well. We take the truth of some of our political convictions so much for granted that it's as though they're observations that we've made, where we say, oh, we can't pass this law because it'll have this effect. Well, actually, it turns out it won't have that effect. Well, now we need to find another explanation why we can't pass this law, because it's almost a sure thing that we shouldn't pass it because it's part of my identity, it's part of my social group, it's part of my party platform, things like that. So I do think people often reason more looking to give explanations rather than to give reasons. And this is, in a way, is a form of the self-delusion because they're sort of deluded about the security of the objectable views that they have.
So I want to pick up on two things that you said. The one is this idea that people have a short memory when it comes to politics. And it's the 75th anniversary of 1984 this year. And the idea that the party has in 1984 is that if you can control the past, you can control the present and you can control the future. And so if you erase things, you can then claim that things happen differently. And there's the collective consciousness, will sort of believe that you've always been eternally at war with Eurasia, as opposed to East Asia. And then you can change the positions a week later, and everybody will, eternally believe that. You remove all the evidence. And it seems that it's almost impossible now to remove all the information. In 1984, you have, clerks who are physically dealing with physical records. And now everything is digitally backed up in a decentralized way. But there's a different problem, which is that there's just too much information. And you still have the memory problem. So people still won't actually recall what happened, or very few people will recall what happened. And it's possible to find anything out, but there's just a deluge of stuff all the time. And a lot of people really struggle to work out what's important in that deluge, that there's so much kind of mind pollution floating around. To draw the golden strand to work out what you ought to believe is quite difficult. The other strand is, you mentioned this idea of philosophers, writing to princes, and it made me think about Machiavelli as the prince. And I thought, if you were to write a guide for a politician to say, how would you like to amass as much power as possible? What kind of epistemological practices would you want to inculcate so that you could do this? We know that people have this limited memory. That they might struggle to kind of read through massive information. What would be the strategy if you wanted to hold on to power?
Yeah, so obviously I'm influenced by my times, but I do think that finding a way to heighten people's sense of sort of emotional identification with individual beliefs would be a big part of it. So, currently working on a series of little articles coming from the book for Quillette, and one of them I think is going to start out. I don't know if you have these signs there. The "In this house we believe." Do you know "In this house we believe"? The signs with like, "In this house we believe every human is human" or something like that, which seems true. We believe in, science is real or something like that. I don't know what that means. But yeah, I would find a way to, I would want to find a way to make people think that, agreeing with me puts them in a sort of category of human being, that their opponents might not be, right? And that if they disagree with me, they're at risk of removing themselves from that category, right? The good category. One thing about American politics right now, I don't know if it's true of politics elsewhere, but most people seem to believe that their opponents have had the wool pulled over their eyes, right? Most people are theorists, lay theorists of ideology or propaganda or fake news or conspiracy theories or something like that, right? Most people think, well, I'm one of the ones who didn't get tricked, right? And that's part of an identity as well, right? I was able to see through the lies. And the lies could be anything, right? It could be the lies of capitalism, it could be the lies of racism, or it could be the lies of anti-racism, right? It could be the lies of the deep state. It could be, the CIA is lying about how it committed all these coups or something like that. Or it could be the lies of the third worlders who opposed the CIA, even though they were, bringing who knows what to who knows where, right? So I think that right now is sort of like an essential tool in political beliefs in particular, is making people feel smart and special for what they believe, right? You have to be smart to believe this. You have to have seen through everything. Even when sometimes, you run the numbers or you do a poll and it turns out, a lot of these types of beliefs are actually sort of the average intelligence of people who hold it is like not that great. So, there's a line, there's a sort of, in a way, what you might call a naive cynicism about politics among some people in the United States who just say, well, every political actor is sort of the same. They all want power, and there's not really any difference between their views because they're just going to do whatever they want to get power. Turns out this view is correlated with not being a very sophisticated thinker, which I guess is not a huge surprise because it's a sort of intentionally unnuanced view. But I think that would be, I would want people to identify with their views. I would want to have an emotional, social identification. I think another thing to think about if you're trying to help a prince gain power through beliefs, through epistemic means or something like that, is how are they transmitted? Um, and there's different kind of transmission mechanisms that go with different sets of political beliefs in the U.S. Certainly, different accusations of different kinds of transmission mechanisms. Hard sometimes to know if beliefs really are transmitted this way, or in any of these ways. I'm a little bit of a skeptic about a lot of them. So, anti-woke people, for instance, will say, "Oh, people go to college and they come out with, all these beliefs." So, like taking over the colleges, that could be a good way to transmit your beliefs, or setting up your own news station like Fox News, or setting up a lot of nonprofits. George Soros is accused of this. Um, Sometimes there are appeals to pure self-interest. People, there are sinecures or favors programs. The spoils system, it used to be called in the United States. Um, then there are, in terms of transmission of beliefs, there are the sort of more the vaguer, more inchoate things. When sort of social justice oriented people talk about patriarchy or white supremacy, they often they give this sense that they think the beliefs are transmitted. They're just like out there. They're sort of like what we live and breathe, and so they're transmitted very passively. They're taken on and transmitted very passively. Um, so I don't know, if I had to recommend one of these transmission mechanisms, um, I'm not sure exactly which one I would recommend.
Something you said is interesting, which is correlating particular beliefs with the average IQs of people who hold them. Um, do you think it's, if you really want to know the truth, that it's just a matter of finding out which beliefs are correlated with the highest IQ, and then boom, there you got your answer about the way the world is?
No, so that would make things a lot easier. I do believe in IQ and intelligence. It feels like there must, in some sense, be some correlation. Um, there's also been, you know, one question is, are we, do people aim their beliefs at the truth or do they aim them at something else, especially when it comes to political beliefs? So in these cultural cognition experiments, which I talk about it in some section of the book, um, Dan Kahan, who is I think a law professor at Yale, and some other researchers, they formed the view that high intellect people, in forming their political beliefs, they use their intellects in order to sort of be able to predict what will have social costs. And so their idea was that smarter people are better at predicting what will be socially costly, and that's where the intelligence goes rather than assessing the truth. And they came up with this by looking at rates of bad answers to statistical questions, where people had answered well when the questions weren't political and poorly when the questions were political. When I say were political, I mean, it could be something about, you know, this percent of people, this drug had this side effect, but this percent of people, how many, well, blah, 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 versus, you know, um, something where the topic is like immigration or gun control or abortion or something like that. So when the political issue is involved, the cognitions seem to get worse. Um, the other reason why you probably can't read accuracy off of IQ just comes from like class dynamics. Not that I'm a Marxist or anything, but the different classes of people may have different patterns of exposure to different sorts of what you might call ideology or to different kinds of party platforms. In the US, I do think that there's a sort of expert class, which has a sort of set of prescribed beliefs, some of which are accurate, some of which I think are probably inaccurate. It would be really nice if we could simply measure people's IQs and then figure out what they believe um, and decide what to believe about politics. The other thing to say on this issue is sort of like, so my view of what is a political belief is very capacious, right? Um, so like, should we close our borders? That's like a political issue where it's sort of, you could vote on a bill about it. But I also consider all the sort of possible reasons for voting on that bill one way or another as being political beliefs, right? So how many immigrants do we have? What would be the effect on employment? What would be the effect on, imports and exports? How many people would come here legally if illegal immigration were stopped or something like that? So all those I consider political beliefs as well. And one pattern that you might have is you might have, high IQ people doing very well on some of the sub questions, but then maybe reasoning in a motivated way and how they get to the high level question. Because usually it's the high level question, the one that would end up in like a party platform or plank. That's where there's usually the most felt emotional or social identification, right? And it's completely available. And I do it a lot in my online writing. It's completely available to somebody to say, I hold this view just like this other person, but they made a bad argument. They have bad reasons. They're like a sloppy thinker, right? And it's fun to you get a lot of, objectivity points or whatever for disavowing somebody on your side. But you might think if you disavow them, but still find your own route to the same belief, that could come from a form of motivated reasoning as well. Not necessarily, of course. So I think there's a question of, where the intelligence would hit, and how it would be used at different stages. So it might be an intelligent person would be really good at sort of assessing the ground level facts, and then maybe really good at assembling them into a narrative that isn't disturbing to their political identity.
So I'm interested to know if you think that there are better and worse environments that you can create to generate political beliefs that are more likely to track the truth. So there's this interesting principle in the Talmud, which is that if you have a person who's tried for murder, then you would have 70 judges, sitting on the bench, and all 70 of them found that he had committed the crime of murder. The sentence that they would pass was that he would be acquitted. So they would say, you're free to go. And that seems strange. But the idea is that if you had so many judges agree, that you're likely to have a problem in the system, because that level of unanimity is so rare that it probably points to corruption in the system. And you might find that in academia often, that there is a very rapid consensus over a particular topic that might be incredibly different from what it was, let's say, 5 years before. I'd say quite confidently 30 years ago, almost all academics would have said there are two sexes. I think if you look at the data on that now, a lot less are confident in saying that there are only two sexes, and that it would be, an act of apostasy to say that it was only two sexes. But you can have this new consensus that emerges, partly because there's a punishment for deviating from the conformed view. So if you care about truth, or you think that truth is one of those things that's tenable, what are the things you do to ensure that it comes out?
That's an amazing so in a way, that notion anticipates what we call epistemic democracy, which is a sort of theory of the wisdom of crowds, and which relies on people having independent judgment, right? So epistemic democracy has to do with sort of if people are better, are decent at finding the truth, and if their mistakes aren't correlated with each other, then you're going to get, instead of majority votes at the sort of system level, you're going to get really, really reliable results. So one way of interpreting the Talmud example you gave, or passage you gave, obviously not knowing much about the Talmud, I can't know whether it's the right way, but one way of interpreting it is to say that if a lot of people think one thing, the most likely explanation is that maybe it's true, right? But if everybody thinks something, then you might search for a different explanation for that level of consensus, right? You might think truth alone does not normally compel a consensus of that sort. And you also might think, maybe we're in an epistemic situation where people aren't really thinking for themselves, right? And when people don't think for themselves, just to make it clear, say you have 5 people voting on 5 issues, and they each get 3 issues right and 2 issues wrong. Well, if they all vote the same way, then the majority will get 3 issues right and 2 issues wrong. And if their votes are completely uncorrelated, it turns out the majority gets everything right. Just like a fascinating little example of how of how, individual competence does not alone determine group competence, right? The differences in diversity among individuals also matter a lot. So your question was, what are the environments that are good for political beliefs? And I guess my answer would come from what I was just saying, that the environments that are good for individuals doing the best epistemically might not be the environments that are the best for groups doing best epistemically, right? I go back and forth a lot in the book, and I say, well, here's one view, here's another. I don't want to endorse. One of the things that I think comes out in the book, and maybe I do endorse explicitly, I don't even remember, is that like the group level value of independent thinking. And I think it's a little counterintuitive, because normally we think somebody who's a very independent thinker is very self-motivated, right? It's very individualistic, right? Very sort of intellectually entrepreneurial, right? But actually, epistemically, it turns out that the person who's very independently thoughtful, a very independent thinker, what they really do well is helping out the group, right? Whereas following the group in some ways, not just socially, but in terms of just like keeping safe from mistakes, of various sorts, the follower can sometimes do better as an individual than the independent thinker. So for the group level, I think a central thing is just sort of encouraging people to think for themselves, encouraging diversity, not punishing diversity. It's going to be published soon. I'm in a debate about the value of ideologies and parties. And in general, I'm an opponent of things like ideologies and parties. I was in Europe 4 months ago, and some of the things I heard about, like the coalitions that get built, and the sort of the way when you build a coalition government, you get these agreements that are sort of like, how did those two parties ever find each other? But they found each other on this one issue, and that's what they decided to organize around for now, right? It just seems like a contrast to the U.S., where our politics basically are centered around there being two parties. Even some people will say like two types of people, right? Is the view that some American political commentators have, that there are fundamentally two types of people, and that's why we have a two-party system. So I think at the group level, for me, more chaos, more diversity, more independence is always good. At the individual level, what sort of environment should an individual be in order to come up with the most reliable political beliefs? That's a different kind of question. And I do think, one of the safest things an individual can do is avoid controversy. So, one thing that some philosophers think is that they believe in what's sometimes called political humility or political skepticism. So when there's sufficient controversy over a political issue, that alone might mean that we should just withhold our judgment about it, right? And so we can avoid error. A lot of questions in epistemology come down to, would you prefer to be right sometimes and wrong other times, or would you prefer to avoid being wrong, even if it means also avoiding being right? So political humility, I think, at the individual level can go a long way. When you see that there's controversy, or when you have to rely on a lot of other people to form your views, when you don't know when you don't know where a view came from. A lot of political beliefs have this sort of like email chain letter feel to them, where some people will cite some statistic or cite some idea, and it turns out it just sort of was made up in thin air by somebody. I call them political rumors in the book. Obviously, there are some good general tips about what's sometimes called epistemic hygiene. Like, if you're studying that sort of statistic, maybe look it up. Maybe see where it came from. If there's a lot of disagreement, maybe look hard into the people on both sides. There's general things to say about forming beliefs in sites of controversy.
So I'm interested, you talk about political beliefs. I'm interested what political knowledge would be. So in spheres other than political epistemology, we talk often about knowledge. the reason I'm interested is because it seems to, I mean, my personal view is that you can have no true political beliefs. So my personal view is that no political belief that any person ever forms has a truth value of T, of true. The reason for that is that it always refers to social phenomena that don't exist. But let's just for a moment assume that social phenomena do exist. I think there's another reason to think that political beliefs would never be true, and that is that they're always overly simplistic. So something I said earlier is that ideologies are very simplistic. Name one political belief that you think is true. And if you can't, then surely there's no political knowledge. There's only political beliefs, which are all false to different degrees.
Why don't I do something slightly different? And I think there must be some political, just by the way, in terms of the way that I define political beliefs, right? Where it's sort of all the way down, all the beliefs that could be reasons for the high level political beliefs. So there are, in the US, there are controversies about, let's use an example that I had before. There are controversies about how many people are in the United States who came here illegally, right? So that, to me, that's a political controversy. That's a political belief. There must be a truth of the matter, right? Like that one, there must be a fact of the matter about how many people here are undocumented, or whatever the current term is.
So then I just want to clarify, I just want to understand, would you call the claim that X number of immigrants entered the US last year a political belief? I would have thought the political belief would be the assessment of that. So I would have thought the political belief would have been, well, that's a good thing. That's a bad thing. We should close the borders. We should open the borders. I would have thought that's the class. In other words, I would have thought political beliefs are always normative. If what you're saying is political beliefs could also just be descriptive, then sure, you could have true or false beliefs. Actually, not on my view, because there aren't immigrants on my view, because that's a social phenomenon. But let's put that aside and just assume there are immigrants. Yeah, then yes, you could have true beliefs.
You're not a moral anti-realist, right?
No, I'm a utilitarian.
Well, so as a utilitarian, in the more limited view of political beliefs, there must be, a legislator is thinking, I have two choices. I can vote for the bill, or I can avoid voting for the bill, right? And the legislator thinks, I ought to vote for the bill, right? Isn't it the case that according to the utilitarian, so on your account, that's a political belief, and on a utilitarian account, it must be the case that it's either permissible or impermissible to vote for the bill, right? So it seems like the legislator must be either simply right or wrong about that, right?
So I take it that there's two values that we could talk about. There's probably many more than that, but in this case, there's two values. The one is a moral value, and the other one is a political value. So the moral value says that X bill will have a higher utility than Y bill. That, if we vote in favor of this bill, it'll have a better outcome or a worse outcome than not voting in favor of this bill. I don't deny that. So I'm a moral realist. I think that utility exists and things can go well or poorly. But then there's a second value, which is, well, the voting for this bill is better politically, whatever that means. Does it mean that there's that we're more politically justified in doing so? I don't know what that means, because I think it's a junk concept, but I think that it's a concept widely used. People use it all the time. They say this party would be a better choice for the country, and they don't necessarily mean that this party will result in better outcomes. They might mean this party has views that are politically just, and their competition doesn't. And I don't know what any of it means. I think it all might be junk all the way through. But I just want to get at, like, when do you think that any claim about let's say ideology? So do you think any claim about Marxism is right, Marxism is wrong, capitalism is good, capitalism is bad? Do you think any of those claims could ever be true?
Well, so I want to do a few things in response to this. So first of all, you talked about political right, political justification, things like that. So this is a topic I'm very interested in, is how do the moral and political relate to each other? I'm actually a moralist about politics. I think this would probably surprise some people because usually I think, people like anti-woke people might be interpreted as anti-moralization or something like that. But I find it really hard to make a sense of, and there's been a bunch of papers about this recently. I find it very hard to understand what normativity or prescription about political actions would be if it weren't robust standard morality or ethics, right? Um, well, there's also obviously like the self-interest of a political actor, like, am I going to get voted in again? But again, that's a standard type of normativity that we understand, like instrumental rationality, right? Um, so I don't really, make space for the political as a new normative category. Some people try to, but I haven't been able to make sense of it, except in this sense of like a special kind of self-interest, right? In the sense of maybe politics is a kind of game that you can win or lose at, the way chess is, right? I believe in chess normativity of a sort, right? If somebody has a gun to your head and says, let yourself get checkmated, you've still made a bad chess move, even though obviously you've done in some sense the right thing and also the right thing by your own self-interest, right? So there could be a political game in that sense, right? But not one that involves what I would think of as justice or really justification.
I want to give you a case. I want to give you a case that might split the hairs with for political justification versus moral justification. So when COVID happened, there was this big discussion about whether we should lock down or not. Assuming that COVID was really bad, let's assume it was much worse than it was. Let's assume that COVID would have resulted in a 50% death rate of everyone who caught it and was highly transmissible. It definitely wasn't the case, but let's just imagine a disease that did that. It seems like it would be the right thing morally to lock down because it would result in the best utility. There'd be a whole lot of people who wouldn't die. But it might still be politically unjust because it would involve a level of coercion by the state that on people's that would undermine people's private freedoms. So it could be both. It could be highly morally justified, but highly politically unjustified.
I think I'm going to dig in my heels a little bit on this one. Unfortunately, I feel like to me, the normativity of resisting coercion or avoiding coercion just must be moral normativity. I don't quite know how to process the idea that like we should do it in some sense and we shouldn't do it in this other sense, and that they don't interact with each other. It it is the case that, again, in thinking in terms of, there can be moral reasons. There might be a short-term and long-term concern, right? So it could be that if you coerce people to stay at home, yes, it saves people's lives, but in the long term, you create a completely unstable regime, and people revolt against it, and it's actually way worse for the world. So stability, I think, is a descriptive notion, but that can have obviously important normative implications. But in terms of simply coercion as a matter of some sort of political justice that isn't moral, I do think it's the sort of candidate that people have in mind when they talk about this. But it's not something that I have the intuition for. I think the right thing is the right thing, and sometimes we do the wrong thing because we don't want everybody to get mad at us. And that's life. I do that too. But I would in that situation, assuming that it's all as you described, and assuming the truth of utilitarianism, of course, with those assumptions, I would say it's not really politically just. It's just sort of like avoiding making people angry. So that was on the question of moral versus political justice. The other question you had was about ideologies. Aren't they too simplistic? Well, I think this is getting into some of the stuff I really love but have not thought through yet. Probably stuff you might have thought through a bit more. So for years, I meant to write a paper on like what are isms. I get into this just a tiny bit in the book. When an analytic philosopher thinks of Marxism, well, not all analytic philosophers, but if we were to study Marxism in a class, often we would be studying well, here are the propositions, right? Here's the theory as a set of claims, right? And it might be like a philosophy of history, a view of morality, the so-called labor theory of value, which most people don't like, a view of what exploitation is, a view of what alienation is, right? A view about class and of what the relevant classes are, and what the nature of capital is, and all these things, right? You can make it a big theory, you can make it a small theory, you can say big Marxism, small Marxism, naive Marxism, sophisticated Marxism, but that would be what the ism is. It's a set of claims, a set of propositions, right? And well, some of those claims will be true and some will be false. But I get the sense that a philosophical theory is not what you meant by an ideology. The other way that these isms are sometimes thought of as sort of like the parts of the mindsets of average people, not philosophers, that motivate them to take certain kinds of actions or justify certain kinds of actions or situations to them. And in this sense, I can sort of see more what you mean, where a lot of the ideas that are thought of as part of those ideologies are very, very simplistic. So you might think, it might be a part of capitalist ideology. People deserve what they work for. And it might be a part of Marxist ideology, people should have their needs provided for, or something like that, right? Those ideas are like probably not going to capture everything that we want out of our concepts of desert and need and value and things like that, right? So in that sense, I think, ideologies are probably the sorts of ideologies in this sort of sociological, psychological sense that people have are probably not what a final philosophical analysis will come up with, right? Like not what a good philosophical theory will come up with. Although I do think, on the other hand, philosophy is a process that we engage in over years of refining and recalibrating these things. So I do suspect that good philosophical theories probably come out of what is initially sort of vague and confused and overly simplified ideologies that are then refined. I think that's just, in a way, those are the tools that we have, right? We don't start with perfect notions in our head. We have to improve them.
So I want to say two things. The first is to amp up Jason's view about the distinction between politics and morality. We might think that when we look at decision making by politicians, we might care about legitimacy. So how was that decision made? Did that person actually have authority? Did it come out through a democratic process? Was it made by a dictator? And the outcome of the decision might be moral, immoral, could be separate. And we might denounce a moral decision because it was made through an undemocratic process. And we might accept an immoral decision because everybody participated in deciding it, even if they got to a suboptimal outcome. So you can imagine a distinction there. What I wonder about is this, which is one of the values that seems very important in America, maybe less so in other places, is this idea that states ought to be neutral about the good life. So allow for a variety of different views to be aired about what it is to lead a life of flourishing. Whereas other countries might take a strong view on this and say, well, if you live in Saudi Arabia, the good life is a Muslim life. And there are certain values that you must abide by. You can imagine all sorts of states having particular views about what you ought to do for yourself or for others, and that they are far from neutral. Liberals will claim that they're neutral, and I wonder if you think that liberals really can be neutral, or whether there's something incoherent in that concept.
Yeah, so this is a debate I've struggled with for a while. It's something I've seen online. Obviously, there are anti-liberals on both the left and the right. You have a lot of socialists and Marxists are anti-liberal, and you also have sort of new generation of anti-liberal or post-liberal Catholics, who I've interacted with a lot of them through Twitter, through my writing at Notre Dame when I was doing my PhD there. Even here at Princeton, it's big because the program I'm here in has a lot of Catholics that I'm in here, as well as the sort of New York literary scene. This sort of idea is big right now. One thing I'll say about the anti-liberal is they can't quite sometimes seem to decide about liberalism, right? Sometimes they say, well, it's this toothless milquetoast thing that isn't strong enough to fight against threats to our traditions or something like that. But then they also say, well, actually, it's this, it's steamrolled all of our traditions into the dust, right? So there's a little bit of doublespeak sometimes about, is it too empty or is it more full than it claims? I definitely think that, and you see this even in Rawls, in political liberalism. It's not completely hollow. His notions, his supposedly procedural liberalism does have some substance to it that is sort of built in through notions of what it means to be reasonable or what it means to be rational, right? Some of it has to do with a certain amount of, he thinks everybody in a liberal nation should have some skepticism about whether their way of life is best, right? You shouldn't be completely certain that you picked the right way of life. And well, that seems like already sort of a liberal notion in some sense that you're building in. And so his argument comes out of that, but you might think that's already built in. In terms of the sort of felt, the Catholic post-liberals will use a phrase, actually existing liberalism. And I think what they mean is sort of like, what are we encouraged to do in a liberal society? How are we encouraged to treat other people? What do we expect to see? So, in a liberal society, you might expect to hear a lot of people speaking different languages, see people walking around in different kinds of religious garb, or see, different, places of worship next to each other, different restaurants with different kinds of food. And you might be expected, a certain amount of politeness about these differences might be expected from you, right? It's not all freedom in a sense, right? Because liberal tolerance is an ethos of its own, right? You might be expected not to comment too much if somebody lives a life very differently than yours, especially if it's private, right? Some polyamorous people who I know are very surprised at the sort of public vehemence that their lifestyle sometimes meets with. Where they say, "Well, I'm doing it in private. Why is it even any of your?" This notion that things just aren't people's business, which I'm not saying is wrong, but I think it's part of sort of like the felt life of liberalism. So I don't think it's the case that liberalism is sort of completely substance free. I don't think it's completely free of its own vision of what the world should look like. On the other hand, neutrality always happens within a sort of range of different options, right? We're neutral. We say here's a range of acceptable options, and among those we're neutral, right? Nobody thinks it impinges on neutrality to say being a serial killer is not an acceptable way of life, right? We've decided that that's not something that we accept. We've decided that we're not okay with that. And that's good. That's good that we're not neutral on being a serial killer, right? And I think it's completely possible and completely feasible to say within this range of options, we can make it quite a big range, and we can say once you've picked one of those options, we're okay with it, right? And so, of course, there's going to be a question about how did you pick that range of options? How do you decide what were the acceptable and unacceptable options? But within that range, I think neutrality is both philosophically and psychologically possible. And really, neutrality and fairness have been thought of as sort of desiderata for some of our political institutions for a long time. One thing I've started saying about Rawls, a lot of Rawls is simply finding a way to systematize the old story about, dividing a tract of land between two people. How do you do it fairly? Well, one person picks where you divide it, and the other one picks which one is theirs, right? So it's a neutral process simply because neither side is allowed to advantage themselves, right? By doing both the splitting and the picking, right? The veil of ignorance is basically that story at a different remove, at a different scale, right? I think most people would agree that, the rule of law is a liberal notion, but I don't think anybody really denies that there should be laws, and that there shouldn't just be some autocrat making every decision, right? So I think I think everybody's desired system will have notions of neutrality or fairness or objectivity at some level. And that's part of why, I've always found some of these debates about liberalism writ large to be a little ill-defined. That's when, we can use some more analytic philosophy, right? Like say, and I always get into these things with political theorists because I just, I say, please define your terms, please put an argument out there. So I think if you formalize neutrality in different ways, it'll seem more or less plausible. If you formalize objectivity in different ways, it'll seem more or less plausible. But yeah, I submitted an abstract for this. There's a sort of festschrift for Jason Stanley's new book with David Beaver in Germany in October. They have this whole section on how like you can have words that have the same meaning but different connotations, and they think that this sort of undermines the notion of liberal neutrality somehow. And I think unless you're very, very specific about what you mean by liberal neutrality, it's not going to have any effect on it at all. So it's just a long-winded way to say, yeah, some of the critiques are getting at something accurate, but probably not getting at a position that people actually hold, right? Nobody thinks we need to be fully neutral. Nobody thinks we need to allow serial killers to exist in our society. And I think the debate would go a lot better if people were sort of much more specific about what conception of neutrality they were working with.
Well, Oliver, I want to say thank you so much for being part of the show. It's always wonderful having you here. And we really enjoy hearing from our listeners on Brand Nevat. We see you as a political community in and of yourselves. Please share your comments on YouTube and send us a voice note about what you thought of this episode and about your personal political beliefs. And make sure to get a free copy of Oliver's book, because Oliver paid an enormous sum of money to ensure that all of you could read it for free. So there's a link in the description below.